Welcome to TFR Insights. I'm your host, Swapnil Bhartiya, and my next guest is Stephanie Fairchild, Senior Analyst at ClearPath Strategies. Stephanie, it's great to have you on the show.
Thank you.
ClearPath Strategies recently conducted a research in collaboration or for Linode to explore the trust developers have in their cloud providers. But before we deep dive into that research, I would love to know a bit about the company and your own background.
So at ClearPath, we offer strategic consulting, campaign expertise, and public opinion research for world game-changing leaders. I particularly work in the tech sector, and we work with game-changing leaders, and progressive forces out there.
So now let's talk about the research. So tell me a bit more about the research, the topic, methodology, and who did you talk to?
The research was basically on what is the role of trust for developers in choosing a cloud provider. So we talked to people who were professional developers, independent developers, and just a smattering of developer enthusiasts, just to get a wide range of sample to see where people were looking for their cloud hosting provider, who they were choosing, and why. We were also looking at trust, that we were looking to define trust. So what does trust mean? Is it trust in functionality? Is it trust in values? So we asked a battery of questions to help both define and understand how trust played a role in how people chose their cloud provider.
Before we talk about, as you said, how do they define trust? I would, throw the ball at you. When you were doing this research to understand trust, what did you mean by trust there?
We weren't actually trying to define trust. We wanted to understand how developers defined it. And so we asked a range of questions about trust in performance, trust in security, trust in functionality, as well as trust related to more value-related measures. So trust in cloud hosting providers to not take advantage of you, trust that they wouldn't host companies that were morally objectionable, things like that. And so we defined trust very broadly, and then just allowed the data to guide us in that way.
If you go back to, as you're explaining, that you threw a lot of questions at a participant, a developer, that what trust mean to them, what kind of things that you found there? How did they define trust, or what trust meant to them?
We allowed them to define trust in a lot of different ways. We asked just probably 30 different measures of trust. And those ranged from, again, trust in performance, trust in functionality, trust in security. So those more like performance related measures, as well as those trusts in values. Do you align with the things that I believe? Are you aligned with things that I stand for? And so we just gathered that information from these developers that we spoke to understand where does trust play a role in how they select the cloud hosting provider, and does it play a role, and if so, how large? So that was essentially the role of the survey.
Beyond this, is there any other finding that you're like, oh wow, we were not expecting that, or something that you're like, if you have to pick these 5 things, what were they?
So there were some interesting things, and I think that what we really found was that trust actually does indeed play an important role in a developer's choice of a cloud hosting provider. That trust, as defined in this instance, is trust in the provider meeting their needs. So are they going to deliver industry standard security? Are they going to scale infinitely with their infrastructure? Are they going to offer transparent pricing? We found that those are the trust measures that are probably the most important for developers when choosing a cloud provider. And we looked really deeply at the differences kind of between hyperscalers, so the big 3 like Amazon, Google, and Microsoft versus smaller providers like something like a Linode or DigitalOcean. And so we looked at essentially the main questions that we asked were, do developers trust the hyperscalers, those big 3 companies, to provide what they need, to match them in measures of values, and how important is that to their choice? So what we did find is that, yes, trust plays a role. Developers will choose companies that meet their needs first, but it doesn't mean that trust and sort of alignment of values is not important. So that's kind of, those are some of the discoveries we made. So yeah, we found that when prioritizing needs or values, developers reported that they actually prioritize their needs over their values 3/4 of the time. So about 73% of the time they would prioritize their needs over their values.
And I have talked to a lot of folks who use other alternative cloud providers or even the big threes. And one of the things, especially when they work in the open source space, is that they choose a cloud provider based on the fact that their values align with the value of the cloud providers as well. And sometimes that actually supersede the trust they might have, the scale at which the hyperscalers can operate. They don't really care about all those things. What they do care about is, hey, our values are same. So can you talk about the value aspect as well?
We found that with many people, trust in their values, their alignment of values did play a large role. And there were cracks in the surface of those hyperscalers in that realm. So while developers tended to, on average, choose cloud hosting providers that met their needs, that role of trust in their values was important to them. So what the survey really revealed was that although these SMB developers voice trust in the provider of choice in general, a deeper examination of their values uncovers that trust and values issue when it comes to those major cloud providers. So I think what's really, really interesting is that at least a fifth or more of the developers we interviewed believe that, or that we surveyed, believe that the big three hyperscalers are going to fail in measures of trust in their values. So they are going to, so some of the measures that we asked them, they believe that the hyperscalers are going to leverage their brand to stifle competition. They believe they're going to focus on their shareholders' needs more than their own needs, more than the developers' needs. They're going to host or work with companies that these developers find morally objectionable. They're going to monetize their data, their own data that they create for their own use. So the hyperscalers will use the data the developers create and then monetize it for their own use without their permission. They're going to lock them in with proprietary tools. We see that all the time. They're going to compete against them and put them out of business. They're going to actually take their proprietary information, recreate it, and sell it as their own. And then the other measure that scored pretty highly here was that they're going to take advantage of these developers. Those types of things, those alignment of values issues should be table stakes. And no company should be failing when there's a question of being taken advantage of, when there's a question of monetizing someone else's data or leveraging your brand to stifle competition. I believe, and I think that where we see the slipping in the realm of the big three is in these values measures. And that's what our data actually showed.
So it seems like these types of values-related trust measures should be table stakes. But in at least in the survey that we conducted with our developers, the developers do feel that there is a reason to withhold trust in particularly the big three, the hyperscalers, in relation to their trust in their values. I think that's really good news for smaller providers like Linode. The developers that we spoke to indicated that small providers do tend to match on measures of performance, security. So those really like low bar table stakes measures that a provider will need to provide to meet the needs of these developers. Small providers do tend to match them on these measures, but they are more trustworthy on measures of values. So that's where there's an opening, and smaller providers can get a really good foot in the door is by showing where they are aligned on values with developers.
Stephanie, thank you so much for taking out time from your schedule today and talk about this survey, and also share some insights that you learned through developers, that what are the things that they really value when it comes to picking a cloud provider. You mentioned trust, you mentioned a lot of things. Sometimes all we focus on is performance and pricing, but the fact is there are so many other things that we care about, or as you rightly said, we should care about. So thanks for sharing those, and I would love to have you back on the show. Thank you.
It was a pleasure to be able to share what I learned. Thank you.